I think everyone is probably familiar with word association games. You know, where I say one word and you say the next word that pops into your mind. If I say Catholic, you might say church. If I might say Pope, you would say Catholic. If I say dog, you might say cat. I want to give you a phrase, and I would like for you to say out loud the first word or words that come into your mind. You ready? The Third Reich. Okay, I heard German, I heard Nazi, I heard Hitler, I believe. I might have heard a few other variations on that theme. It is remarkable to me to think of how many people there are, and I think everybody here of school age even knows that the Third Reich was German, that it was in Germany, that it was led by Adolf Hitler, and of course that Hitler was the leader of the Nazi Party. That has been so dominant in television, World War II movies, you name it. Everybody knows about the Third Reich. But I wonder how many of you could tell me or put any kind of an association with the Second Reich or the First Reich. Well, obviously, if there is a Third Reich, there is a Second Reich, isn't there? And if there's a Second Reich, there must be a First Reich, mustn't there? Well, indeed, there is. The official name, the full name of the First Reich was the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. The Holy Roman Empire, the German word, by the way, for empire is Reich. The Third Reich was the Third Empire. Now, I'm not going to try to give you today a lesson in German history. That's not the point. But I think it's important for us to understand that the First Reich, that deeply rooted in the history of Germany, is a structure called the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. The Reichsführer, that is the leader of the Reich, the leader of the empire, the emperor, was the original one in the First Reich. The Holy Roman Empire was crowned by the Pope. What many people probably do not realize is that the first Pope who was ever crowned, the first men to whom the Catholic Church put this title of Pope, were not crowned. But the first one who was ever crowned was crowned by a German. His name, Constantine, a German warrior who conquered the Roman Empire, took the title of Roman Emperor, and himself crowned Sylvester as the first Pope to be crowned, and the first Pope really of what became and would become the Holy Roman Empire. For a long time thereafter, every single Pope was crowned by the Roman Emperor. The temporal leaders, the kings, the rulers, the emperors, the people with military power enforced their will on the Catholic Church. And while they allowed the Christians of Rome to vote on who the Bishop of Rome would be, and allowed them to decide that he would be the Pope, the decision to crown him or to confirm him or to allow him to be the Pope was strictly the decision of the emperor. In years to come, that would change as the power of the papacy grew, as the power of kings waned, as the ebb and flow of power moved across Europe. European kings became to be crowned by popes, and popes crowned by kings depending upon who had the most authority or the most power at the time, and sometimes it's almost as though one crowned one and then he crowned the other, working their way around the whole circle. Charlemagne was probably the best known of the early European rulers, was crowned by a pope. Hitler's Third Reich, he himself was not crowned by the Pope at all. However, his empire was firmly founded on Rome. He believed in it. He believed that he was actually in the succession of Rome. He adopted Roman symbols for his Reich, the Hakenkreuz, or the hooked cross, as Germans call it. We call it the swastika, was the symbol, actually, of ancient Rome. I have a picture in my lower right-hand drawer of my desk, black and white photo I took in the British Museum, and up in the top corner is Roman silver, and here's this large serving tray, silver serving tray, and imprinted right in the middle of it is the swastika, or hooked cross, of the Roman Empire. Long before the Holy Roman Empire, long before Constantine crowned the first pope who was crowned, Long before this tradition of Rome began to dominate Europe, there was a man named John. He was in the Isle of Patmos for the witness of God, because he apparently had been faithful to God, and he had been exiled to the island of Patmos. And he was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, we're told, actually carried in the Spirit into the day of the Lord. He dropped into vision, and we got from his vision the book of Revelation, as we call it. The word in the Greek is apocalypse. It means revelation or revealing. It is a strange thing that this book that many of us think is so obscure was given to reveal, not to obscure. It was given to show God's servants things that were to come to pass, not to hide them from them. And there follows in the book of Revelation an astonishing series of visions with mythical symbols and strange beasts and creatures that were you to sit down and if you had the artistic talent to do them and to draw them would be frightening and be the things of which people's nightmares are made. But there are some very important things that come out of this vision that make a connection between the ancient world and the world that we live in right here and right now. I'd like you to turn back to the 16th chapter of the book of Revelation, to the time when the seventh vial, or the seventh plague actually, is being poured out. It says in Revelation 16 and verse 17, "And the seventh angel poured out his vial into the air, and there came a great voice out of the temple of heaven, from the throne, saying, 'It is done.' And there were voices, and thunders, and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake, such as was not since men were upon the earth, so mighty an earthquake, and so great. And the great city was divided into three parts." Note that expression, quote, "the great city." It was divided into three parts, and the cities of the nations fell, and great Babylon came in remembrance before God to give unto her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. Now I want you to understand something. When John was in the Isle of Patmos, when he fell into a trance and fell into vision, Babylon was not. It didn't exist. All that was left were ruins, sand, desert fowl, lizards, dirt. An Arabian would not even pitch his tent there for fear of ghosts or spirits that might inhabit the old city of Babylon. It was desolate. There was a community not that far from Babylon, but it was not old Babylon. Babylon, it seemed, had long ago received its judgment of God, hadn't it? I mean, it had been destroyed of old. God had prophesied it would be torn down, it would never be rebuilt, there would be nothing but a habitation of wild birds, and even the Arabian would not pitch his tent there, he said, and it had happened, and it was so. Now we are told that the time will come in the future when great Babylon is going to receive of God what she deserves. He is going to give to her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. Every island, we are told, fled away. The mountains were not found. There fell upon men a great hail out of heaven, every stone about the weight of a talent. And men blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, and the plague thereof was exceeding great. Chapter 17, verse 1. "And there came one of the seven angels which had the seven vials, and talked with me, saying to me, Come hither, I will show you the judgment of the great whore that sits upon many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication. The inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman." Now remember, we are in vision. This is the stuff of which dreams are made. It's rather nightmares. It's weird things, colorful things. He had his vision in full color, I might add. And the strange things that had already happened, I suppose, by this time may have inured him a little bit to it. But later, John sits down and writes all this down. This is another thing we must remember. He is going to write all this down. I think it might be worthwhile for you and I to ask, what do you suppose John thought it meant? First of all, he was given this as a revelation, not a concealing. Unlike Daniel, who was told, "Go your way, it's not for you to know these things," John was told no such thing. He was told, "This is given to reveal to you things which are going to come to pass shortly." What do you suppose, when he had finished writing it all down, he thought? What did he think it meant? "He carried me away in the wilderness I saw a woman upon a scarlet-colored beast, full of the names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. I don't even know how I would begin to draw this beast. They have seen, actually, there was an ancient monument that had the gods, as it were, fighting against a multi-headed beast. It had 7 heads, and it had, I believe, 4 or 5 horns down its back. The horns were not on the head, as we are accustomed to see them. They were actually positioned along the back of the beast. This was old, went back into, I think, ancient Babylon, as a matter of fact. It was the god of chaos that was being demonstrated by this 7-headed and many-horned beast. This one has 7 heads. And by the way, in that particular inscription, 4 of the heads had been killed. They were hanging, and the gods were in the process of fighting with the 5th, and it was obviously was fighting his way up from the bottom, killing off each of the heads of this strange medieval beast, or I'm sorry, not medieval, but mythical beast. And anyway, the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, and she had a golden cup in her hand full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. Now this in itself is a fascinating description, you know, and her name. The connection, though, of what John is now seeing. Here he is, forward into the day of the Lord again. God is showing him visions of things which are going to come to pass, and he shows him the judgment of the great whore who is called Babylon. But remember, Babylon doesn't exist. The old city is gone, destroyed. So what is John now to make of it when God shows him, yet again, Babylon? And calls her that. She is a woman who rides upon a beast. But he's going to explain to him what it's all about. When I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus, and I saw her, I wondered with great admiration. Now this in itself is somewhat revealing. Many of the commentators who struggle with this passage of Scripture, trying to date it, they basically have oriented it somewhere in the early 60s A.D., or there are only 2 dates that receive serious confirmation by scholars. Somewhere in the early 60s and somewhere in the mid-90s A.D. Now the factors that are involved in this, some of them have to do with the mark of the beast and 666, which is supposedly translates out through numbers to Nero Caesar, which they feel then would place it at the earlier date. But then on the other hand, at that time, the level of persecution of Christians had not reached such a high level, and so they felt maybe this drunken with the blood of the saints would not quite carry the weight that the later date would carry. It's an interesting study, and if you're bent that direction, you can get a good commentary and read up on all of the theories having to do with the date of it. But the fact is that even at the earlier date in the 60s, the city of Rome had been consistently responsible for the death of no few of the saints, so there's no particular reason why that would be a problem. But especially when you consider this is looking forward. It is not merely dealing with the time in which they then live. He says, I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus, and when I saw her, I wondered with great admiration. And the angel said to me, Why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has 7 heads and 10 horns. Ah, good. We're not going to have to be left totally in the dark. There will be some explanation. The beast that you saw was and is not and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. Well, that may be a little helpful, but I could wish for more, couldn't you, in terms of explanation? He says, And they that dwell on the earth shall wonder, whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was, and is not, and yet is. Now, I will pause at this point to tell you that most commentators down through history, the vast majority, in fact, equate this woman with the city of Rome. The woman who rides the scarlet beast is the city of Rome. The beast itself is the Roman Empire. And in fact, as you work your way through the passage of Scripture, if you didn't have a commentary, you would come to the same conclusion if you have any knowledge of time. And it's going to be very clear that when John looks at it, John, from his perspective, can make no other assumption but that the woman is Rome and that the beast is the Roman Empire. Now, from our perspective today, this statement was and is not and yet is might make a little more sense than it did to John. For us, the Roman Empire was in the past tense. When we speak of the Roman Empire, we think in terms of the Caesars. We think in terms of the city of Rome. We think in terms of legions. We think in terms of Titus and of Nero and of Tiberius and the ancient imperial Rome or the republican Rome before it. And when Rome fell and finally the barbarians came in, we think in terms of there being an end of Rome, and that Rome, in strict terms, the Roman Empire today, is not, right? And yet, it is. This is something that would make sense if you understand that a version of the Roman Empire, something claiming to be the Roman Empire, something with its spiritual power emanating from Rome, even though it is not the old Roman Empire, then it was, and it is not, and yet, in a manner of speaking, it is. And here is the mind that has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains upon which the woman sits. This in itself is fascinating, and many people have pointed this, the fact that the city of Rome is built on 7 hills. It's known as the city of 7 hills. And so the almost physical relationship is there, and yet there is a spiritual thing, and an explanation, a symbolism involved in it as well. There are 7 mountains upon which the woman sits, and there are 7 kings. 5 are fallen, the other is, and I'm sorry, lost myself. 5 are fallen, 1 is, and the other is not yet, but when he is come, he must continue for a short space. Now, the problem you have when you deal with something like that is understanding where you are. If John is looking at that and assuming, as he probably did, initially at least, that this was going to be fulfilled and the whole thing was going to come to a cataclysmic end within a very few years, he would have had one perspective of it. And yet if you look at it as him being carried forward into the day of the Lord, that is the very end time of human history, then this would be looked at in quite another way. You don't have to resolve that question today. You just look at it, file it away in your memory, and go on. And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th and is of the 7, and he goes into perdition. Like I said, isn't it wonderful that he chose to clarify all this for John? And the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings for 1 hour with the beast. These have all one mind. Now there is something here that you can play with a little bit. These 10 kings obviously are contemporaneous. They are not successive. They have one mind. They receive power, collectively speaking, 1 hour with the beast. The other 7 you could easily assume were, and the way it's worded sounds very much like it, they are successive. Some of them are in the past, 1 is present, 1 is yet to come. In other words, you have the idea of 7 successive empires, emperors, kings, however it might be interpreted. And then you have, in culmination, 10 who are contemporary with one another. Now, one would assume that, being the case, that there are 10 kingdoms or principalities or nations that are administered by, ruled over, supervised by these 10 kings that we look at here. Now, we have always tended to say, well, king just means a ruler. It's just somebody that's over a nation. It could be looking at anything. And yet there are those who have often watched the royal families of Europe with a full understanding that they are still there, that there are hereditary leaders still there, people who have claims to hereditary office still there. It would be bizarre indeed if we came down to the end time and we suddenly began to see some of these princes elevated to kings and receiving power for a very short time because it suits the beast that they do so. But that's another question. It says, these have 1 hour and will give their power and their strength to the beast. These shall make war with the Lamb. Now, once again, this is, infallible. They are contemporaneous. They all make war with the Lamb. The implication is that it's at the end time because the Lamb shall overcome them, for he is Lord of lords, King of kings. And they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. More explanation is to come. The waters which you saw where the whore sits are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. So we have, first of all, a woman. We have then a beast. And then we have great vast waters. The woman rides the beast. The city of Rome rides the empire. And the empire itself controls multitudes of peoples and nations scattered all over the earth. We're talking about geopolitical power of the highest order, staggering in all of its implications and how far it might reach. And it says in verse 16, "And the 10 horns which you saw upon the beast, these shall hate the whore, and shall make her desolate and naked, and eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. For God has put in their hearts to fulfill his will, and to agree, and give their kingdom to the beast until the words of God shall be fulfilled. And the woman which you saw is that great city that reigns over the kings of the earth." Now, who does John suppose that great city might be? Well, there was no alternative for John. When he came out of vision, when he sat down and contemplated these words, and when he actually took pen in hand and wrote them down on paper, absolutely the only possibility for interpretation to John was Rome. The city was there. It was on 7 hills. It was the only city of that kind of power in his world. Rome, identified. Now, you may wonder, who do Roman Catholic theologians think this is? People have asked, they go, well, what does the Roman Catholic Church think when they see this here? What do you think? They say this great city that rules over the whole earth is Rome. They acknowledge it. However, it is civil Rome, not ecclesiastical Rome. Not the Roman Catholic Church, not the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church, not the papacy, but the city of Rome. But mind you, it has never been called the city of Rome. What it has been called is Babylon. That is also interesting. And John may not have merely assumed that it was Rome. For in fact, Babylon did not exist. Babylon has become a symbol. Rome at that time was the living symbol of everything that Babylon stood for. Even the old religion of Babylon was there. Even the old forms of worship had made their way to Rome. Rome was so identifiable with and part and parcel with ancient Babylon that it was inescapable as such. Now, why am I telling you all this? Because it's very important initially that we understand the deep, strong, inextricable connection of the heartland of Europe with Rome and with the Roman Empire. It has been there for 2,000 years, and it isn't going to go away just by thinking something else. It's real. Europe has traditionally been allied with and have thought of themselves as Roman. And of course, as long as Europe has been dominated by the Roman Catholic Church, with the Pope setting up and taking down kings and kingships and empires, and using kings and empires to actually carry out his will, to actually wage war on his behalf, there's been no question that Rome impressed her will. Spiritual Rome this time, not the city. For the old city, the old empire was and is not. And yet, Babylon is and has never ceased to exist. Chapter 18 of Revelation, verse 1. After these things I saw another angel come down from heaven, having great power, and the earth was brightened and lightened with his glory. And he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, and has become the habitation of devils, the hole of every foul spirit, the cage of every unclean and hateful bird. Now, I don't know if you have a Bible that has marginal references, but if you cast your eye down your marginal references in most of these reference Bibles, you will find reference after reference after reference to 2 chapters in the Old Testament, Jeremiah 50 and Jeremiah 51. These 2 chapters prophesy, in no uncertain terms, the fall of ancient Babylon. And it's prophesied in almost identical terms. The same words are used, the same expressions about cups and drinking and waters and the destruction, and how that Babylon is going to be destroyed by a people out of the north, how that they're going to turn on her and burn her with fire. All the pictures, all the descriptions are in Jeremiah. Do you suppose John knew this? Well, certainly he did. He was fully aware of it. Some of the verbiage is almost identical. A scholar might conclude, if he did not wish to look at the supernatural, he might conclude that John had Jeremiah in hand when he was actually writing this prophecy. But of course, this is the person who gave Jeremiah the message, is giving John the message, and the message is the same. Many have pointed to the fact that it says Babylon the Great is fallen, is fallen. This is poetic, but it has fallen once, and it will fall again, because that is the message of it. All nations, it says, have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her. The merchants of the earth have gotten rich through the abundance of her delicacies. And I don't think people have any idea yet how powerful the economics of this system is going to become, and how rich some people are going to become as a result of what she does and how she carries out her plan and implements it. I heard another voice from heaven saying, "Come out of her, my people, that you be not partakers of her sins, and that you receive not of her plagues. For her sins have reached to heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Reward her even as she rewarded you. Double to her, double according to her works. In the cup which she has filled, fill it to her double. How much more has she glorified herself and lived deliciously? So much torment and sorrow give her. For she says in her heart, I sit a queen. I am no widow. I will see no sorrow. Therefore shall her plagues come in one day. In mourning and famine she shall be utterly burned with fire, for strong is the Lord God who judges her." All this stuff comes straight out of Jeremiah. And it really happened to the old city of Babylon. She who had dashed other people's children against the wall had her children dashed against the wall. She who had burned other people's cities had her cities burned. It happened exactly as she had done to others. And the kings of the earth who have committed fornication and lived deliciously with her shall bewail her and lament for her when they shall see the smoke of her burning, standing way off for fear of her torment, saying, Alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour is your judgment come. The merchants of the earth shall weep and mourn over her, for no man buys their merchandise anymore. And this goes on at great length about the loss of the merchants and all of the wealth and the power. You are dealing with a powerful market, a director, a mover, a prime shaker of markets and of making money. It says in verse 21, a mighty angel took up a stone and like a great millstone and cast it into the sea, saying, Thus, with violence shall that great city Babylon be thrown down, and shall be found no more at all. And the voice of harpers and musicians and of pipers and trumpeters shall be heard no more at all in you. No craftsman of whatsoever craft shall he be found any more in you. And the sound of a millstone shall be heard no more in you at all. And finally in verse 24, and in her was found the blood of the prophets and of saints and of all that were slain upon the earth. The vivid thing about this to me, it was not many nights ago I'd been fishing and was cleaning fish, and I took my filleting knife and went into the vent of this fish and took it right up through the belly and opened it up, and out it came. I'd caught it while it was feeding, on surface feeding, on shad and minnows. And as I opened the fish up, out flowed all these little minnows, a whole handful of them, all still intact, not even digested. And I thought, well, there's no question what that fish has been eating. The imagery here is of the time when that great whore will be gutted. And in her, as they open her up, will be found the blood of all the saints. It's a staggering, horrible image that is presented before us. But I want to take a moment because, again, I'm trying to make a connection for you between history and prophecy, one that needs to be understood, needs to be clearly understood. I want to read you a few excerpts from a book called Germans. The book is Germans, the biography of an obsession by George Bailey. It was published in 1972 by Times Mirror. It says the history of the Jews as a persecuted minority began with the conversion to Christianity of Emperor Constantine, who, incidentally, was German, or was of the German race. For with the conversion of Constantine, not only did the Christian church become the state church, The empire became a church state. Constantine's court bishop chaplain lost no time in formally excluding the Jews from the doctrine of salvation. From then on, the Jews were cited by the established church as the classic examples and objects of God's wrath. From then on began the discrimination and persecution. Under Constantine, Jews could not keep Christian slaves. On pain of death, no Jew could marry a woman employed in the imperial factories. The Jews were branded by the church as a dirty sect, as morally and sexually vicious. Theodosius the Great passed a law equating marriage between a Christian and a Jew with adultery. This is just the beginning. Where did it start? It started in the church. That is, the Roman church. Now bear with me, because there are many quotations in here that I would like for you to deal with, if you will. It was natural then, reading a little later, that Judaism should have been branded by the church as not merely as a false faith, but as the false faith, as the superstition. The German word for false faith is Afterglaube, literally, anus faith. In the Middle Ages, folklore associated the devil with the anus as the wrong end, the end opposite the face, the source of filth, stink, and evil. The German word for superstition is even more important. It is Aberglaube, literally other belief. In medieval history, and German history is medieval history, the other belief, superstition, is fully as important as the belief, Christianity. Indeed, the other belief is the dark side of the definition of the belief. The other belief is a blanket term, of course. The absorptive capacity of the blanket is astonishing. Judaism has the distinction of being the first other belief to have been and remain singled out for special censure by the church, as in the formula, quote, the damnable perfidy of the Hebrews. In the 9th century, the words concerning the perfidious Jews were included in the liturgy of the Roman church. The liturgy is a part of what is pronounced out of the mouth of a priest in the process of performing a Mass. It finds its way into the church liturgy concerning the perfidious Jews. He says, the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 put the Jews in the same category as heretics, created the Inquisition, and decreed that all Jews must wear special badges. I bet many people thought that started with the Nazis, when they made them wear the Star of David or a yellow patch or some sort of a badge to identify them as Jews. Oh, no. It actually originated with the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215. It was done by the church. It mentions the Inquisition. And I know that no one has any idea how many Jews died in the course of the Inquisition. But this bloody church would claim never to have killed anyone. And in a perverse sort of way, they will be telling you precisely the truth. For the priest did not kill anyone. The bishop did not kill anyone. They used the state to kill. The Inquisition was the holy office of the Inquisition was the one who simply found out. They used soldiers to torture confessions out of people. They didn't do it themselves. They used the soldiers to burn people at the stake. They didn't do it themselves. They used soldiers to stretch people on the rack. They didn't do it themselves. They actually adopted a kindly posture. They wanted to relieve the person of their suffering. They would stand there and say, now tell us the truth, and this can all be over with. They played the good guy in the old routine of good guy, bad guy, as you try to extract the information you want out of people. It may come as a shock to you, but the Catholic Church probably killed more good Catholics than it did Jews. Because who knows over the centuries how many good Catholics were turned off, were absolutely horrified, were amazed and astonished at some of the things the church were doing and rejected them out of hand. It is the truth. Martin Luther was a good Catholic who came to the place where he could no longer stand many of the things the Catholic Church was doing. And he left the church, was excommunicated. He was lucky. He was in Germany at the time, and the political elements that were involved, his protectors were able to protect him from the Roman Catholic Church, or Martin Luther would have gone to the stake himself. Judaism, or Jews, along with Christians and true Christians, and along with a lot of well-meaning and well-intentioned Catholics, went to their deaths in the course of the Inquisition. There is so much that was done. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 prohibited all intercourse between Christians and Jews. It was Germany's first non-fraternization order. Part of the same order was the prescription of social costumes, badges for the Jews, so as to render them easily identifiable. The three most popular lies about Jews in the Middle Ages were then propagated with great energy. The defilement of the host, that is, of the body of Christ as it was represented in the Eucharist, the poisoning of wells, and of ritual murder. The Germans believed that the Jews needed the blood of Christians for use as medicine to cure strange and terrible diseases which afflicted only Jews. Christian blood was also believed to be used in the preparation of unleavened bread for the Passover feast. In 1298, roving bands of religious fanatics, most of them peasants, under the leadership of a self-styled aristocrat named Rindfleisch, which means beef, laid waste to 146 Jewish communities in Franconia, Swabia, Bavaria, and Austria. According to a Christian source, some 100,000 Jews were slaughtered during this crusade. In the course of the 15th century, Jews were driven out of virtually every city in Germany. This heritage is a lot older than Adolf Hitler. As a result, the Jews in Germany were forced to form new, self-supporting communities outside the towns. This called for a tightly drawn, highly disciplined way of life and rendered the German Jews the most Talmud-bound and resentful of their brethren in Europe. But in Germany, the Jews shared the fate of the Germans in one all-important aspect. They were confronted, as all Germans were, with the fateful phenomenon that is fortunately without precedent or parallel in history. The tragedy of both people source, the Reich, or to use the full title of the Reich's most durable manifestation, the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. Now along came, during some of this time, a man named Martin Luther. As I said, he was a good Catholic. He was a priest. But he saw the abuses, the selling of indulgence. He had a whole long list of things that he did not like about what the Roman Catholic Church did, and finally broke with the Roman Church. In his earlier years, he had a much more tolerant attitude toward Jews. But, quote, as he grew older, and the Jews continued unrepentant, Luther became extreme in his abuse. His last sermon, preached 4 days before his death in his birthplace, Eisleben, he devoted entirely to the Jews. He demanded that they be expelled from all German lands. He had already advocated the burning of all synagogues and the confiscation of all books written in Hebrew. He even went so far as to demand that Jews be prohibited from praying. That harkens all the way back to the book of Daniel, you know, where they said nobody's to pray to anybody except the king for so many days. And Daniel, of course, went right ahead and prayed like he always had. It's astonishing that a man who would have known his Bible as Martin Luther did could have ever made such a statement. And of course, he had basically done away with the Old Testament in its entirety. Luther proved to be a fountain of anti-Semitic propaganda. His pronouncements against the Jews are ingenious, overpowering, thunderous, and final. Luther was, of course, chiefly responsible for the headlong pitch of religious conviction in Prussia, particularly in the German land generally. Now he continues by saying it's not in the least surprising that Luther should have been so horribly disappointed by the failure of the Jews to respond to his apocalyptic feat. You see, the reason he was so angry with the Jews was because they had not responded to him. He could not understand this. He said because basically his feat was the discovery of the meaning of grace. Luther regarded himself as a sort of second St. Paul, whose crucial contribution was going to be the conversion of the Jews. He really believed that he was going to do that. And yet he was no more successful than was Paul. When the conversion of the Jews was not forthcoming, he took fright. It's amazing how often fear is a factor in these things. He took fright lest the Jews managed to infiltrate the Reformation. A fear he expresses in his first pamphlet against the Jews, Letter Against the Sabbateans or Sabbatarians. Think about that one for a moment. Letter against those who keep the Sabbath. He goes on and he makes a statement later. The Jew has been created by God to serve as a spy wherever a betrayal is in the making. That's a horrible thing to say. You know, the Jew has been created by God to serve as a spy anywhere a betrayal is in the making. This particular charge, as one example among many, was directed against what the newspaper called Jewish, German, Republican, Freemason conspiracy in France that came to a head in the Dreyfus affair. For his part, Luther did not scruple to exhort his readers to exterminate the Jews. The word, ausrotten. Exterminate them. Get rid of them. Now, you know, when you look at Lutheranism today, and that sort of thing would be totally anathema to them, and Yeah, but the founder of their religion, who was German to the core, who had been Roman Catholic, and of course who had been grown up in a faith which execrated Jews, which considered Jews as the lowest of the low, which actually encouraged and carried out the extermination of Jews in many parts of the world, never gave up, really, that part of his upbringing. It is a shocking thing to read and to consider. Now, later on, some other things begin to take place as you come to not the First Reich, but the Third Reich. The Catholic Church in Germany and Austria elsewhere was not a democratic institution. I'm on page 177 of Bailey's book. It was not a democratic institution. No more was the pagan German tribe. The devotees of both longed for a strong, guiding, patriarchal hand. They blamed all the ills and abuses they saw in the changing world on the lack of maintenance of authority. Who? The Catholic Church and the pagan German tribe. Whatever it was, however they were related, they both had one goal in common. They saw the lack of authority, of dominant authority, as the cause of their troubles. As a result, there were strong movements. They blamed the ills and abuses they saw in the changing world on the lack of maintenance of authority. The Catholic hierarchy in the 20s and 30s, now we are in the 1920s and 1930s, they simply could not conceive of a non-patriarchal society. Now bear in mind that Germany of the Third Reich was a patriarchal society. The Führer, the father, the fatherland, it was all patriarchal. And it was authority. It was one person telling the family what to do. They could not conceive of a non-patriarchal society. As a result, there were strong movements inspired and supported by the Church in the direction of authoritarian government. The Church was encouraging authoritarian government, as manifested in the regimes of Italy, Germany, Spain, Portugal, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, and Croatia. This is not to say that the Catholic or the Protestant Church deliberately supported fascist and radical fascist or Nazi movements. The process that ensued was not as simple as that. Almost as often as not, the Church even tried to forestall fascism by prompting or taking over fascist theories. I want you to think about this. The Church tried to, the modern word is co-opt, which means is you take a belief that somebody's got, you grab it before they actually begin to use it, and take it for yourself to prevent them from using it. The Catholic Church co-opted fascist doctrines in order to forestall their development under fascist governments. It did it in such cases as the plea for a Christian anti-Semitism as distinct from a mere political, opportunistic, or pseudo-scientific anti-Semitism, as though it were better. Christian anti-Semitism is better than these other kinds. Robert Corbett, disciple of one of many Austrian writers and churchmen, announced in the book he co-authored on anti-Semitism in the Reich after 1932 that ecclesiastical anti-Semitism was almost as old as the Church of Christ itself. Well, indeed, it is. In fact, it's a lot older than that, the desire to destroy these people. In a conversation in the Reich Chancellery in 1938 with the Minister of Justice Hans Frank Hitler, quoted from the New Testament, in the Gospel, when Pilate refuses to crucify Jesus, the Jews call out to him, "His blood be upon us and upon our children's children. Perhaps I shall have to put this curse into effect." Have you ever heard or read more chilling words? Perhaps I shall have to put this curse into effect. The interaction between politics and religion in Germany and Austria grew steadily. No, politics and religion. At the 62nd General Assembly of German Catholics, Munich, of all places, 1922, it was opened by a man named Cardinal Pacelli. Anyone here know who Cardinal Pacelli was? Who he came to be? He was Pope Pius XII. At this time, he was Cardinal Pacelli. He actually opened this conference in Munich. It was an unbroken procession of Catholic leaders that included Konrad Adenauer. They spoke out strongly against the dictated Peace of Versailles. Most vehement was the speaker from the Tsar, which had been cut away from Germany during a plebiscite. He said, "We will remain with you in spiritual union," said the latter, "until the hour of unification strikes again. Nothing could be so unnatural as the dismemberment, nothing so unnatural as the dismemberment of the German East can long endure. You realize when that was said? 1922, after the First World War, when Germany had been divided for one reason or another, in efforts to keep her from having the power that she was accustomed to, lusted after, and had abused so seriously. 1922. This statement was made at a Catholic meeting, the 62nd General Assembly of German Catholics. We cannot tolerate the dismemberment of the German East. The speaker for the Sudeten Germans in Bohemia said, "We have come here to bind more closely the community of faith and folk. We too feel ourselves to be true folk comrades. May the self-laceration in Germany one day cease. Then will come the day of the German people." That's Der Tag. Then will come Der Tag of the German people. And also for those of us who languish under a foreign yoke. Where was this said? At a General Assembly of Catholics in Munich in 1922. The president of the Catholic Assembly, Konrad Adenauer, in speaking against the dictated peace of Versailles, appealed to French Catholics and went on with things that he had to say. There is so much, so much. The story goes on and on. The confluence of the two broad movements. I won't be very much longer in the book, bear with me. The politicized church militant and the religiousized folk politics was reached in the autumn of 1933. That's when Hitler took power. In the official publication of the Catholic youth movement in Germany, which is entitled Comrades of the Shield, I couldn't pronounce the German word, when the church defined papal infallibility in the year 1870, ran the statement, it anticipated on a higher level the historical decision which is being taken today on a political level, for authority and against discussion, for the Pope and against the sovereignty of the Council, for the Führer and against Parliament. You want to think about the thinking of that for a moment? About the involvement of the church? First of all, I've laid out for you the church's history of anti-Semitism. The fact that it was a Christian anti-Semitism, as they call it. That it was in the roots of the church from the very beginning. That it was proclaimed by Catholic and Protestant church leaders in Germany long before Hitler came on the scene. Hitler comes on the scene, and the Catholic Church has not left. Catholic leaders are still there. And this is a statement made in Comrades of the Shield, the official publication of the Catholic youth movement, which would have been published with full approval by the hierarchy, or it would not have been published at all. They said that when the church defined papal infallibility in 1870, it anticipated on a higher level the historical decision that is being taken today on a political level for authority and against discussion, for the Pope and against the sovereignty of the Council, for the Führer and against the Parliament. This was the Catholic position in 1933. Think about it. It goes back and talks about this woman, Babylon, who was full of the blood of the saints. And this woman is identifiable as that great city, Rome, and the empire which was, and is not, and yet is. It's not that difficult to follow how the power of ancient Rome found spiritual expression in the Roman Catholic Church. And the same goals of the old Roman Empire were espoused through the means of the papacy in the years following the dissolution of the old empire. This statement could not have been made, it says, without precedence of the Concordat. The Concordat between the Vatican and the Third Reich is perhaps the most controversial document of our time. It was signed on July 20th, 1933. Now, a Concordat is an agreement between church and state on who's going to do what. What areas are going to be under church control and what areas are going to be under civil control. The papacy reached a Concordat with Adolf Hitler with the Third Reich. It says it was signed on July 20th, 1933, a fateful date in modern German history. It represented 13 years of untiring effort by Cardinal Pacelli, who later became Pius XII. It was his achievement, just as it was his conviction, that the church needed Germany fully as much as Germany needed the church. Pius XI, the Pope before him, accepted the Concordat for the same reason. He saw the Third Reich as the God-given bulwark against Bolshevism, specifically, and against the gradual but relentless disintegration of authority in general. Why did Pacelli work for it? Why did Pius XI accept it? Because they saw the Third Reich as a bulwark against the disintegration of authority in general. And the Catholic Church was unable to see it in any other terms. And they signed their name to something which made possible the most heinous crimes, frankly, in the history of mankind, in which the blood of millions of people, 35 to 60 million, depending upon whose estimate of the dead in World War II you want to take. A great many Germans saw the Third Reich in the same way. Not a few Germans, and not only Germans, saw striking similarities between the church militant and the militarist German state, between the Christian ministry, the monastery, monasticism on the one hand, and the SA and the SS on the other, between the cross and the swastika, or Hakenkreuz, or hooked cross, as the Germans call it. This attitude was formalized in the Concordat. There's something very appropriate about the hooked cross, or a symbol of the Third Reich, because the perversion of the cross and of the religious symbol had been carried by the Catholic Church down through all these generations by the Third Reich, even with the tacit approval, at least initially, of the Roman Catholic Church. This attitude was formalized in the Concordat, to which newly appointed bishops were required to take the oath of allegiance to the National Socialist State. You understand that? Newly ordained priests were required to take an oath of allegiance to the new National Socialist State. That's Article 26 of the Concordat. And a prayer for the government and the German people was to be offered at the completion of every church service. Article 30. Most important, the Concordat broke the back of Catholic resistance to Hitler and National Socialism. Because you see, the truth is, there were good Catholics in Germany who hated what Hitler stood for, who hated what he had already done, who could see the direction things were going, and who refused to submit. They were resisting and would have continued to resist. And if the Pope had back then, like our new Pope, like Wojtyla, backed the Solidarity movement in Poland, Hitler would have never come to power at all. But they broke the back of Catholic resistance. The inevitable culmination of this attitude was represented by Herbert Lanzinger in his oil portrait of Hitler as a knight in shining armor on horseback bearing the swastika banner. He was Richard, he was Raymond, he was Godfrey at the gate, he was St. George killing the dragon of Bolshevism. Here points out in his book that by the way, Adolf Hitler was a Roman Catholic. He was not a practicing Catholic, but he was a Roman Catholic. He points out that Catholic Adolf Hitler was never excommunicated, and that Hitler's books were never placed on the index of prohibited books. You ought to read Mein Kampf sometime. You ought to see what Hitler says. You ought to read his racial references. You ought to read where he talks lightly about killing people, sweeping people out of the way, annihilating people, doing away with people in Mein Kampf. It was never put on the index of prohibited books by the Roman Catholic Church. One wonders at which point in his career Hitler might have been excommunicated. But then they ask the question, who's going to move for his excommunication of the Vatican? Pacelli? Not very likely. Now, I've taken you through a very long reading, which I don't much like to do. Try to impress upon your mind this woman that is described in Revelation 17 and 18. This great city, who is unnamed, but who, in one sense, but who is called Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, who was filled with the blood of all the saints, has found a fulfillment in the Roman Catholic Church over the last 2,000 years. But I wouldn't want you to make a mistake. In fact, I don't consider that perhaps to say the Roman Catholic Church is the most accurate way to discuss this. For the truth is that there are many Roman Catholics and many Roman Catholic theologians. In fact, the first people to call the Roman Catholic Church Babylon the Great may have been Roman Catholic theologians. that the first people to call the Pope a whore were Roman Catholic theologians. Some of them died in prison for their lack of care in choice of words. So in fact, the Catholic Church over the years, that is the hierarchy, that is the papacy, that is whatever that central core of authority is, that seems to be so full of the blood of the saints, is also full of the blood of a lot of good Catholics who could not stomach what the Catholic Church was doing. So there's no reason for you to feel any antipathy toward a priest in your neighborhood who's doing his best with a bunch of young boys to get them playing basketball instead of having them on drugs. And many people who are in the Roman Catholic Church, some priests, some nuns, would put all of us to shame in the efforts that they have given to take care of the poor, to take care of the downhearted, to work with the downtrodden and the poor, and the sacrifices they have made in their life. A lot of them, as I say, would put us to shame in the things that they have done. So don't make that mistake. Because the fact is that this great whore sits on nations and people and multitudes of people. And it carries out its will. Many times the people, the priests, have no idea. Many times they are afraid. Many times they can't speak. Many times they are cowardly. Some more times it's just not possible for them to do anything about it at all. So we do have to kind of keep our perspective on all of this. Now, I want you to turn back with me to the second chapter of Daniel because I want to connect this up to something else. Over the years, there have been a lot of different theories that have come to fore about the beast of Revelation and the great whore and about the world powers that are going to cause trouble at the end time and who they are and what they are. And it's as though people read these things and they look around them in the world and say, well, that fits, and they'll grab a little thing here and grab a little thing here. They'll get an idea there and they'll concoct these things into a little brew without ever looking back to see what this is all about. Now, what you need to understand, first of all, is that John in the book of Revelation stands right at the pivotal point of all of this. John saw Rome as Babylon. You with me? John saw Rome as Babylon. He was not able to see what this great whore would do altogether in the years ahead. He wrote it down. He didn't witness it with his own eyes. He probably looked at it in certain ways differently from what we would, but he saw it clearly and distinctly as Rome. And he made an absolutely ironclad connection between Rome and Babylon. Turn back to Daniel, the second chapter again, and we'll begin in verse 36. You're very familiar with this, I think, from endless sermons that we've given about Daniel 2 over the years, but pardon me for a moment while I explain. King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and he was deeply troubled by the dream, and he wanted an interpretation of the dream. But he knew the proclivities of his magicians, that they would lie to him. If he told them what the dream was, they would concoct an explanation. Any fool can concoct an explanation of a dream. We could play a game afterward tonight if we wanted to. You tell me your dream and I'll give you an interpretation. Any of us here can give an interpretation. So he gets his magicians in, says, I had a dream, I want you to interpret. They say, well, tell us the dream. He says, aha, I know better than that. If you have the power to interpret the dream, you have the power to tell me what it was. And they couldn't. But they finally found a man who could tell him the dream and who could give him the interpretation. His name was Daniel. And the discussion of the dream and the interpretation begins in Daniel 2 and verse 36. This is the dream, and we will tell you the interpretation thereof before the king. You, O king, are a king of kings, for the God of heaven has given you a kingdom and power and strength and glory. And wherever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field, the fowls of the heaven, has he given into your hand. He has made you ruler over them all. You are this head of gold. Now the dream was of a giant image. It had a head of gold, its breast and arms were of silver, belly and thighs were brass, its legs were of iron, and its feet, and particularly the toes, were of iron mingled with miry clay. He says, you are the head of gold, the top, the best of this that this kingdom is going to have to offer. After you shall arise another kingdom inferior to you, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over the earth. The fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, for as much as iron breaks in pieces and subdues all things, and as iron that breaks all these things, shall it break in pieces and bruise. And whereas you saw the feet and toes part of potter's clay and part of iron. The kingdom shall be divided, and there shall be in it the strength of iron, for as much as you saw the iron mixed with miry clay. And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. Whereas you saw iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men. But they will not cleave together, even as iron is not mixed with clay. Now, what in the world is all this about? Well, historians, scholars, everybody from time immemorial who's worked over the book of Daniel, there's almost universal agreement over the first part of all that we read here. Babylon is the king of gold, is the head of gold of the image. The breast and arms of silver brings us down to the Medo-Persian Empire. And as I say, commentaries are agreed on this universally. The belly and thighs of silver brings us down to Alexander's empire, and then we come to the Roman Empire, which follows it. What this is all about is about the great system of the Gentile governments of the world, which even across ethnic lines, even across peoples, that the system remains intact. Now, what is it about this great system that, and its consistency? A great deal of it has to do with its religion. For the religion of ancient Babylon found its way all the way through Greece and Alexander's empire, all the way through the Medo-Persian Empire, all the way into ancient imperial Rome, and it still exists today. The religion of ancient Babylon is represented in symbolism in this room right now. For those of you who aren't here, listening to this on tape, the room in which we are meeting is decorated already for Christmas. And the symbol of the invincible sun is on that wall in 3 different measures, and all across the back wall in wreaths. And it's on the 4 walls of the sides of you there that you can see them. These all come from the old sun wheel, or the invincible sun, and have their origins in Mithraism, and trace their way all the way back to ancient Babylon and before. That system has remained intact through Babylon, through the Medo-Persian Empire, to the Alexandrian Empire, to the breakup under Alexandria, to the Roman Empire, and to finally the resurrections of the Roman Empire and the dominance of that kingdom which was and is not, and yet somehow is. You know, the book of Daniel, in this regard, again and again, place after place, develops these themes. In fact, it is so clear and so easily followed that commentators looking at it down through the generations have believed that it's just too accurate. And so they have decided that, well, maybe Daniel wrote it much, much later, about 160, after about 3/4 of it had actually taken place. But the problem is that it goes on. The fulfillments of the prophecy go on. The reason I've gone through this thing today is to try to help you to understand why it is that we continually look at and are so concerned about the development of Germany. Because, you see, we believe that the people who live in Germany ethnically today are the Ancient Assyrians. The Ancient Assyrians are the people who originally inhabited the land that Babylon inhabited. They were the first people to come in and conquer the 10 northern tribes of Israel. They are the ones who actually carried them captive in the very first place. They were supplanted by the Babylonians. They migrated north as the Babylonians came on and won the empire and drove them out, and they made their way across the mountains of western Russia into what we now call Europe and Germany. The latter part of all those migrations is well documented, and the names even are there, and the connection with the ancient Assyrian people are there. But you know the funny thing about it? Even without the connection, the Assyrian connection, between Daniel and John, it is traced from Babylon to Medo-Persia, to Alexander, as to Greece, to Rome, and to Germany, in the Holy Roman Empire of the German Reich. It is all part of the same system. And oddly enough, it comes full circle to the Assyrians. Back in Daniel 2 again. In the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. The kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. For as much as you saw that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, the gold, that God has made it known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter. The dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof is sure. You realize that John also saw the return of Christ in connection with the same thing. He saw it that these nations, these 10 nations, represented by 10 toes in Daniel's vision, there are 10 horns actually in John's vision, are all in opposition to Christ at his return. They are all motivated by Satan the devil. We actually are beginning, standing right on the edge of seeing a Fourth Reich. And one wonders at what point in time the holy aspect will be imposed upon it. At what time the Roman aspect will be imposed upon it. I can't believe my eyes. I can't believe my ears. After all these years, and after all I've heard, and after all I have read, and after all I've seen about the antipathy between Rome and Moscow, that the Pope receives the leader of the Russian people in the Vatican. But finally, when all is said and done, who came to whom? The Pope did not go to Moscow. Gorbachev came to the Pope. The Roman Church, its institutions, the papacy, the Vatican, and its power has outlasted government after government after government. And it had the patience to pull the strings of power and to wait, and to pull them again and to wait. And Wojtyla pulled the strings in Poland. He's pulled the strings in Czechoslovakia. He's pulled the strings in Russia. For now, the Roman Catholic Church in the Ukraine is at last free, officially recognized, and able to function again. For their sakes, I am happy for their freedom. But what you are seeing is is an incredible, momentous, historical move by what may be the most enduring, the most consistently strong, the most powerful political force in the world. Mystery. Babylon the Great, the mother of abominations and harlots of the earth.